Hello, this is Dr. Clark, and this will be Chapter 1, Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology, VTHT 1313. So this is going to be a relatively short chapter, and in this chapter we're going to be talking about some just basic terminology right here. And so usually you can go back to the PowerPoints and look right here at the learning objectives. They're also posted in the front of your chapter. So some of the terms we're going to be talking about is anatomy throughout this course, and then on into A&P 2 next spring. And so anatomy is the form or the structures of the parts of the body. So an example of anatomy would be your fingers, your hands, your toes, your nose, your heart. So those are actual physical form and structure. Physiology is actually the actions that occur within the body. So physiology of the heart would be its beating and pumping blood. Physiology of the fingers would be them moving and grasping. Physiology of the legs would be them actually walking and moving you along. When we look at anatomy and physiology, we also have what we call macroscopic or gross anatomy, which means you can see with your own eyes. Microscopic anatomy means you need a microscope to do that, to actually see the anatomical structure. So microscopic anatomy, you need a microscope. Physiology, we do have gross physiology, things that we can actually see with our own eyes, with movements, listening to a heartbeat, breath sounds, different things moving and going on in the body and the actual functions. And then we actually get into things like molecular physiology, which is actually down inside the cellular level, the actual chemical reactions and what actually happens within the cell. And that could also be known as cell physiology. Once again, you would need something like a microscope to see that. So kind of going over it here, we have microscopic versus macroscopic. So macroscopic you can see, and microscopic you need the microscope for. We also have regions versus systematic or systemic. So regional study, that would be something like your hand or your arm. So it would be one specific area that you're looking at. Systematic would be looking at like your skin across your whole body. So that would be one whole system you would study. Or the cardiovascular system, you would actually be looking at the heart and all the blood vessels. Going a little bit past that basic terminology on what anatomy and physiology is, we're going to actually look at planes of reference here, and we'll get more into this in lab. But planes of reference right here they're trying to show is directions and actually how we divide the body up. So right here you can see there's this plane that's actually trying to split the dog into right and left, and that is known as the median plane. You also hear it called the mid-sagittal plane, but I prefer it to be called the median plane. If we cut the dog in half from front to back, that's what's going to be called the transverse plane. And if we kind of cut the dog in top to bottom, that's known as the dorsal plane. Those are the main planes that we use in the body to help divide and decide a couple of key things that we will talk about here. So first off, we're going to go with cranial and caudal. So from this transverse plane right here, if you go from towards the head, that's going cranial. So anything that's pointing towards the head is cranial. Anything that's pointing towards the tail is caudal. So if we talk about the cranial end of the dog, it would be in front of the transverse plane. The caudal end of the dog would be behind the transverse plane. But directionally, if I'm talking about the way that a cut starts, I might say it starts cranial here at the withers and extends 4 centimeters caudally over the back. Would be a way that I would use that terminology. When we get to the head is actually cranial itself. So cranial comes from the cranium or the skull. So when we get to the head, we still have caudal, but instead of saying that something that's on the very front of the face or going towards the front of the face is cranial, we actually use rostral. Rostral means the nose. So if it's on the head, rostral is what we use, meaning if it's pointing or going forward on the face. Dorsal is going to be along the back, and you can just think of like a dolphin with a dorsal fin. And ventral is going to be along the belly. And what makes the decision between dorsal and ventral when it comes to actually the body or the barrel is going to be, that imaginary dorsal plane right here. Kind of divides the animal between dorsal and ventral. And we have directions that are dorsal. Sometimes we might describe something like a mass on the side of the dog is located dorsally on its side. Or on its barrel. So we could say if there's mass right in the area of my arrow right here, it would be on the dorsal area of the barrel located caudally behind the scapula. So the shoulder blade, if it was right behind the shoulder blade, it would be caudal to it. So that's how we kind of use the terminology to describe. When we look at a limb, if it's closer to the body, it's proximal. If it's away from the body, it becomes distal. So the paw is the most distal part of the leg. The elbow would be the most proximal part of the leg. We also, down here on this one, we actually show when we talk about surfaces, we look at the tarsus, which would be comparable to your ankle, and the carpus, which would be comparable to your wrist. If it's above the tarsus and the carpus, and it's on the front of the leg, then we call it cranial. If it's on the back of the leg, we call it caudal. Below the carpus and the tarsus, if it's on the front of the leg, it ends up being dorsal. Whether it's front or back leg, both of them are going to be dorsal. If it's on the bottom of the paw, it's going to be called palmar. And think of the palm of your hand. It's the same thing. If you put yourself and act like you're a dog and put your feet and hands down on the floor, your palms are in front. So the forelimb would be the same thing with the dog's paw on the ground. It's like your palms. So therefore we use the word palmar. The back legs, you plant your feet on the ground, and so that's why they call it plantar, such as a syndrome that you've probably heard of, like plantar fasciitis in people, meaning a tendon that's inflamed on the plantar surface, so hence plantar fasciitis. You plant your back feet on the ground, same thing for them, so the surface of the paw that's touching the ground is going to be known as the plantar surface. Here's some directional terms. These are the ones we use in domestic animals, and right beside it we have the ones that we actually use in human medicine. And a lot of these things are the same, like left and right. Instead of using cranial, they do use superior. Instead of rostral, they use nasal. Instead of caudal, they use inferior. Instead of dorsal, they use posterior, and instead of ventral, they use anterior. A lot of these terms, they're actually starting to change. They're actually starting to use terms like rostral, caudal, cranial, dorsal, and ventral. They're also, so a lot of these other things you see are the same: medial, lateral, deep, superficial, proximal, distal, palmar, plantar. The front of the limb, instead of calling it dorsal, they'll call it anterior, although I'm actually starting to see more textbooks and more of them actually starting to use the terminology dorsal. So the human side is actually slowly coming over to what we use in veterinary medicine, which we're actually using proper Latin roots, and actually things like inferior and posterior and stuff are not actually proper Latin roots. One thing is the body has bilateral symmetry, so the left and right halves of an animal or a person are pretty much mirror images, and so this is actually fairly important. When we're looking at anatomy and physiology, we're going to be teaching you normal. We'll be discussing and looking at some abnormal. But if you want to know if something's normal or abnormal, so like if we have a left part that's swollen, we want to know if it's actually swollen that much. What do we look at to compare it to? Well, the right paw if it's normal. So we can actually look at the halves of the body and tell if one side is normal versus abnormal, because they should be a pretty close mirror image of one another. Body cavities, there's what we call the dorsal cavity, also known as the cranial cavity, but dorsal cavity in the body and in mammals, and this is going to actually hold the brain and the spinal cord. So that's the dorsal cavity along the back. The ventral cavity is actually going to house the thoracic cavity. There's a diaphragm in mammals that separates the thoracic cavity, which is cranial, from the caudal abdominal cavity. Thoracic cavity is going to have the heart and lungs. The abdominal cavity is going to have the digestive tract and the reproductive tract and the urinary tracts and systems all within it. One thing is if you leave mammals, if you go to reptiles or avians, they actually lack a diaphragm, so they pretty much just have a ventral cavity. But in mammals, we actually can further divide, because of the diaphragm, the ventral cavity, into the thoracic and abdominal cavity. Organization and levels of organization of bodies. We start at the most basic functioning unit of the body is cells. And if you get a group of cells that are doing the same thing, you actually get a tissue. And if you get a bunch of tissues that are doing the same thing, you actually get an organ. So a heart, as an example, is you actually have cardiac muscle cells, and so that starts off the basic unit. You actually put a bunch of those cardiac muscle cells beating together, you actually develop a tissue. You put a whole bunch of those cells together around the ventricles and the atriums of the heart, pumping together, and you actually get the organ of the heart. With the organ of the heart and the arteries and veins and capillaries, the organ system you actually get is the cardiovascular system, where blood's actually moved around and pumped around in the body. And then when you put a bunch of organ systems together, like the cardiovascular, the respiratory, the gastrointestinal, the skin or integument, the musculoskeletal, you actually get an organism. So that's your levels of organization. Homeostasis, very important principle right here. This actually is what maintains health. You can look at the Chinese symbols for yin and yang. They have to balance each other out. So the body's constantly trying to stay in a state of homeostasis, which is a state of equilibrium. Everything is equal. All the acids equal out to all the bases. All the oxygen and carbon dioxide levels and equals each other out. The circulation is maintaining at a rate to where chemical reactions are going properly, and nutrients such as oxygen and glucose are making it to the cell. Waste products like lactic acid and carbon dioxide are all being taken away. The immune system is doing its job and functioning properly, and so keeping that equilibrium is very important for the body. Anytime that equilibrium is thrown off and homeostasis is not maintained, that's when we actually get a state of disease. That's when the animal actually loses its health. So as we go forward in this class, we'll be talking a lot about maintaining homeostasis. So that's basically chapter 1, and I will see you in lab.